Thank you, everyone, for coming out, even on a rainy night. Testament to the excitement, which I'm sure you share, for the presentation of this volume, edited by Professors Maria Luisa Ardizzone and Teodolinda Barolini, which comes out with the collana of the Studj Romanzi from the prestigious Università della Sapienza in Rome. The title of the volume is called Vita Nuova, Archeologie di un testo, and this speaks to precisely an attempted archaeology of the text through its reception, both contemporary and subsequent to the century of its issue, all the way up to its reception in the Ottocento. And this involves everything from philological and philosophical issues to the theory of language, which Maria Luisa talks about in her particular essay. And Professors Barolini and Ardizzone not only contributed essays to the volume, but also wrote, respectively, an introduction and a conclusion. So this is very much, obviously, a labor of love, which they have put their imprint on from beginning to end. So I will introduce both professors who will speak more about the volume, and there will be plenty of time for questions about its various components. First, our guest, Professor Teodolinda Barolini, is Lorenzo da Ponte Professor of Italian at Columbia University. Her publications include Dante's Poets, Textuality and Truth in the Comedy, The Undivine Comedy, Detheologizing Dante, also from Princeton, and Dante e la creazione di una realtà virtuale, which was the Italian translation of the former volume, and also Dante and the Origins of Italian Literary Culture, which came out in 2006 and has also been translated into Italian. She's written a commentary to Dante's lyrics, Rime giovanili e della Vita Nuova, which appeared in revised and expanded form in English in 2014. And she is the editor of Digital Dante, and her Commento Baroliniano, a canto-by-canto online commentary of the Divine Comedy, can be found at Digital Dante. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Medieval Academy, and she's the corresponding fellow of the Accademia Olimpica. And more recently, in 2018, she was elected to the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei. She was also notably president of the Dante Society of America from 1997 to 2003. Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone is professor of Italian literature at New York University. She studied medieval paleography, literature, and history at the University of Palermo, in addition to 20th century literature at the Sorbonne in Paris, a topic which she also teaches here regularly. Her principal areas of interest are the Middle Ages, poetry and poetics, rhetoric, intellectual history, medieval philosophy and science, and 20th century poetry, particularly the poetry of Ezra Pound, which, as all of you probably know, had profound engagement with medieval poetry, particularly the cantos of Dante. As a scholar of medieval intellectual history, Ardizzone rereads vernacular texts of the 13th and 14th century in light of ancient and medieval Latin traditions, their multicultural essence and background. Her publications include Ezra Pound e la Scienza, Scritti Inediti Orari, which came out with the very distinguished press Scheiwiller, published in Milan in 1987. Guido Cavalcanti, L'altro Medioevo, which came out in 2006. Guido Cavalcanti, The Other Middle Ages, the English translation of the same volume. and most recently, Reading as the Angels Read, Speculation and Politics in Dante's Banquet, which came out with Toronto University Press, and I believe won a prize as well in 2016. She is also working on a volume in progress on Dante's Commedia, although tonight she and Professor Barolini will obviously discuss more immediately the Vita Nuova. So please join me in welcoming both Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone and Teodolinda Barolini.
Good evening. We have here this volume is the proceedings of Dante's Symposium. Was organized by the Dante Global Project of New York that Professor Barolini and I have created since the 12-15 with the intent of reading each year one of Dante's works. This year we are going to present Dante's Latin works and the Epistole, the last Latin works and the Epistole. The next year we will have a symposium devoted to the Commedia. After that, we don't know what we will do, but the idea is that probably we should continue in some ways, probably in a different format. We will see. Now I go to read at first a short introduction to the Vita Nuova, and then I will summarize some of the contributions which are in the book. And Professor Barolini will follow me with other issues and discourse on contributions. This is the volume. With the title Vita Nuova, Archeologie d'un testo, we present this evening the proceedings of the symposium devoted to Dante's Vita Nuova that took place here in New York at Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò and at Columbia Academy on April 2016. The symposium was a part of the Global Dante Project of New York that Teodolinda Barolini and I started in 2015 with the project of an annual rereading of Dante's whole opus, one work each year. The volume, this volume, a special number of the journal Studj Romanzi published by the Società Filologica Romana and directed by Roberto Antonelli, contains 8 essays plus an introduction by Teodolinda Barolini and a conclusion by myself. Editorial matters, in addition, etc. The book is in Italian, with the exception of 2 essays written in English, that of Igor Candido, and the other is by Donato Pirovano. Now I will read just a few notes on the Vita Nuova. Dante wrote the Vita Nuova during his Florentine years. Probably around 1294, the book was completed, written in poetry and prose, organized in 42 chapters. The libello collects 31 lyrics written for the most part before the prose text. We may date at 1280 the sonnet A ciascun'alma prese gentil core that he addresses to a group of poets, among them the most authoritative Guido Cavalcanti. In this sonnet, Dante offers as a riddle to be interpreted a dream that occurred to him, in which Beatrice is represented as naked in the arms of love, who offer her Dante's heart as food. This sonnet introduces the reader to a peculiar way of writing that was a characteristic of the early Dante and eminently enigmatic. So now this is for me an important aspect of the Vita Nuova. Enigma, as I point out, is a rhetorical figura. Its ground, I recall, flourishes in the field of theology, mostly as Dante uses this. According to Paul of Tarsus, in this life we can know God not face to face, but only through mirror in enigmas. Enigmas are tropes that are difficult to open and to understand. According to recent studies, Tarsus was a center in which the study of rhetoric was highly developed, and Paul's letter to the Corinthians echoes such background. In my opinion, is a very important aspect of the Vita Nuova. It is my claim that to read the Vita Nuova requires attention to the level of enigmas and the role they play in the making of the romance of youth. Enigmas create a pathway meaningful in itself and independent from the attempt of opening and detecting them. If, in the field of rhetoric, the enigma is part of the ornatus difficilis, a complex trope that Dante discusses in the Vulgaria Loquentia, in the theological tradition, enigmas seen in a mirror have the task of raising us up and thus fulfilling the anagogical sense of scrittura. The Vita Nuova introduces practices relating to the reading of the Bible. The link that such difficult a new kind of tuberculosis creates is part of Dante's attempt to educate his reader. Rhetoric and speculation go together. In this way, Dante establishes that the figures or tropes have a meaning that must be explained in prose, and as he writes, echoing the predicate of ancient rhetoric, where in ancient rhetoric, tropos is defined as vitium cum ratione. In the important chapter 25 of Vita Nuova, he suggests that the importance of tropes and their utilization marks the continuity of a tradition from the classical authors to the contemporary poets, or as Dante calls them, dicitori in rima. Here Dante recalls as witness his friend Guido Cavalcanti, to whom the Vita Nuova is dedicated. So, a complex book, certainly a chef-d'œuvre in its own way, Dante's Vita Nuova takes all the literary models and reshapes them powerfully by introducing, so the contributions focuses on these old literary models, introducing a new way of writing with new perspectives and inventing a vernacular able to encompass tones and overtones. The Vita Nuova tells the story of Dante's love for Beatrice, a love that starts when he is near 9 years old, and according to what he tells, he is able to influence and shape his life. It is a romance, but is written in prose verse. It is a book shaped by the memory of things past, but memory becomes a pervasive inner power through which the events are retaught, so that the act of writing becomes a pathway toward consciousness. Dante transcribes, as he writes, only the event written in his archetype under greater paragraphs, and rewrites them in quella parte del libro della memoria dinanzi alla quale poco si potrebbe leggere. With the very first lines of the book, Dante indicates a double essence of writing, which suggests the plural essence of human language. However, the source can be in Augustine's Confessions and probably in the mediation of Bonaventure. There is a Platonic overtone embodied in the story itself that is, of course, close to the theological level of its narrative, but cannot be identified with it. Since the beginning, at a time dominated culturally by Aristotle's philosophy, Dante's Vita Nuova introduces an idealistic Platonic appeal that is destined to transform poetry and its language. The double register introduces readers to the dimension of interiority. On the back, the culture of the fathers of the desert, the entrance of the Homo Christianus, according to Augustine, and the essential role given to the inner human being. What Dante actually does is to copy what is inscribed in his memory. We enter into a dimension in what is interior is the archetype, and the sensible writing is a copy of it. The one who writes is the one who reads. He reads intus. Thus, to the interior intus writing, there corresponds an intus reading. In Latin, intus reading would be intus legere or intelligere. Dante builds, from this point on, a milestone of Western culture in the vernacular. Life is made of scattered events. What gives meaning to them belongs to an ideal world inscribed in the mind. The mind is a storehouse, an archive, and the Vita Nuova narrates a past love story. But, seen in the mirror of the mind, love becomes the power that lives inside the human being. Love speaks the interior world. Following an old way of representation, love is a character, but this personification opens the door to a new way of representing love. If, for instance, we read chapter 12, we see that love appears in dream to the protagonist of the story as speaking in Latin in a way that is difficult and obscure. The value of the difficult is that it offers a formative tool, an idea that Dante takes from a tradition, both rhetorical and philosophical, clearly manifested by Augustine in his book De Doctrina Christiana, a book of rhetoric defined as the Christian Cicero. Actually, love represented as a figura and as a voice is not an invention. Considering only the vernacular of Lingua del Si, Cavalcanti did represent love prior to Dante as persona and prosopopea. Of course, the Vita Nuova is full of traces of Dante's circle of poets. Among them, not only Cavalcanti, but also Guido Guinizelli. What Dante does is to delete systematically the traces of a love shaped by physicality. Beatrice, from the very beginning, announces a new idea about love. From the very first chapters, she is depicted in relationship with Christ and his passion. Love as a passion was the main theme of Cavalcanti's poetry, but Dante, in a reversal that is epochal, counteracts the physicality of passion with the historical event of Christ's passion. The key concept in this perspective is not just redemption. This is a point important for me. The pains of love constitute the human being's interiority. We have here the making of the spiritual human being. Guido, tormented representation of love, had no goal. In his universe of physicality, passions and inspirations dominate, along with physical pleasure. Dante will represent this lost condition in the Inferno. But beyond the fascination that Guido's poetry represents for the young and clearly testified in the Vita Nuova, Dante, since Donne che avete intelletto d'amore, heralds a new way. The manner of lode as troppo alta materia, as he defines it in the prose of chapter 18 of the book, paves the way for a higher idea about love and life. The ladies who have intelletto d'amore are the interlocutors who are able to understand Dante's enterprise. The theme of laude praise, suggested as infinite, discloses a new universe. Before discussing the various essays, I want to touch briefly on what I take to be the central event of the book, on which, however, nothing has been clearly written, but which is nevertheless pervasive and indirectly a reference point for the narration. The importance of Donne che avete intelletto d'amore, the first canzone that introduces in the book, is tied to this. Beatrice, who is recalled to heaven, to whom praise is given, shows her double nature as both human and divine, a concept introduced by the incarnation. The theme of praise immediately suggests her double nature. Laude, a theme discussed and used since antiquity, but shaped by Neoplatonism as a way proper to speak to the divine from the humans, used by Dante to reshape the idea of love. De Robertis and Gorni identify praise with poetry. This is a perspective that unfortunately has not permitted the comprehension of the importance of Dante's choice. The sonnet Tanto gentile, tanto onesta pare, chapter 26, is explicative of the reasons of laude. Beatrice is indeed a creature, but she is described as venuta da cielo in terra a miracol mostrare. The canzone Donna Pietosa, chapter 23, consists of fragments that echo the Gospels and the death of Christ. The death of Beatrice, seen in the dream of the character who says I, is organized in the model of Christ's death. Because of this recognized trend related to the incarnation, the book has been read traditionally as a theological book. We will see what is the tradition of interpretation. Of course it is, but the theological frame heralds something not for the other life, but for a new awareness of the value of earthly life. This is a point of great importance. Dante is the first who writes in vernacular about the value of what is in the earth. Okay. Beatrice's double nature changes the perspective on the human being. Incarnation means that in the human being there is something divine. Although Dante's libello is framed by theology, the discourse is more complex and underscores the tremendous value of earth life and of the importance of practices of everyday life. As Barolini's edition of Rime Giovanili della Vita Nuova, 2009, and republished and translated in English in 2014, fruitfully has emphasized. Now I give just a few informations about the essays of the book, and you will see that everybody in some ways is related to what I have said until now. Scholarship on the Vita Nuova, as it took shape throughout the 20th century, based on the critical editions of Michele Barbi, Domenico De Robertis, Guglielmo Gorni, up to the most recent one of Donato Pirovano, who is one of our authors, has been greatly influenced by masters like Charles Singleton and Domenico De Robertis, to whom we must also add Erich Auerbach, whose essay Figura is the unescapable basis on which all subsequent discussion must rest. Those and other readings responsible for the critical discourse on the Vita Nuova constitute a sort of ideal archive which the discursive practices about the book have founded and to which the essays proposed in this volume wish to contribute. In revising this contribution, this note intends to shed light on one aspect common to all, which I deem especially fertile, and which I call a propensity to discontinuity, to that which does not unify. Indeed, in the text herein collected, I am not interested in evaluating what would delineate a monolithic tradition, a unified design underlying the multiplicity of interpretations, but rather what allows an element of discontinuity to emerge. Thus, this brief note tends to valorize the deviation, the diversity of positions represented by these readings in conformity to the operational criteria which the Global Dante Project has attempted to establish and continues to. Far from any antiquarian perspective, then, Archeologies of a text wishes to emphasizing the taking shape of an ensemble of discourses, analysis, visions which are diverse, sometimes in contradiction or even opposed, but which we consider as vital precisely by virtue of that diversity. Roberto Antonelli's contribution opens the way to such a perspective. His recourse to Hegel's aesthetics allows us to appreciate the suitability of a reading that brings a remote text closer to us by identifying in it a dimension of modernity. Specific to Antonelli is the intention to tease a secular perspective out of the theological one he appropriately identifies in the Vita Nuova. The death of Christ, he writes, which is here the death of a woman, becomes in the Vita Nuova the foundational act of the modern male subject, inevitably to the exclusion of the female one. As a result of this, however, the dimension of that which has been excluded infiltrates the work, seemingly foreshadowed and postulated by the very events that had negated it. Maria Luisa Ardizzone introduces in the reading of Vita Nuova the theory of the interior speech of ancient medieval provenance, a foundational archetype, she argues, not only for the discussion on the origin of human language as it will eventually take shape in the De Vulgaria Eloquentia, but also for the construction of a poetic theory which Dante begins to outline in the Vita Nuova. What she claims is that the discourse on language in Dante does not start with the Vulgaria Eloquentia, as is commonly assumed, but precisely with the Vita Nuova. A look from overseas characterizes Igor Candido's essay, which researches the early readers of Dante in America, and of the Vita Nuova in particular, with which Emerson is already translated in 1840s. 2 decades before, Dante Gabriele Rossetti will do so in England. Candido illustrates how the conviction that Dante must contribute to the formation of the American identity is a key point in Emerson's philosophy. The Vita Nuova, defined as a Bible of love, whose essence is both spiritual and symbolic, creates a textual identity which calls for a new criticism, one that Emerson indicates as transcendental. Already at this stage, the preeminence of life and religion over literature, whose true purpose is its own abolishment, emerges as a crucial aspect. Candido's contribution introduces us to that will be a characteristic of Dante's reception in the United States. If the Vita Nuova is considered by Emerson a work of religious literature, all exegesis of the Florentine poet, and in particular of the Commedia, as it is carried out in those years, is marked by a theological strong interpretation, which is only partially philosophical, as the latter rather defers to the former, and which will lay the foundation for a quintessentially American critical tradition of Dante's work until one certain point, but in the discussion perhaps I can say more about that. Donato Pirovano reconstructs the genetic process of the Vita Nuova, pointing out how it led to the birth of a new book. He emphasizes a series of elements that constitute the work's novelty, particularly in the way they interact. The Vita Nuova, he writes, represents the constitution of a new poetry. It is not a mystical text, nor it can be read as mind's journey into God, itinerarium momentis in Deum, yet the evangelical dimension is strong. Pirofano opposes the provincial ground of the Vita Nuova. He substitutes the time of grace for chronological time and sanctions the preeminence of poetry. The Vita Nuova is shot through with a vigorous desire for communication, and for the sake of it, it makes itself available to the creation of a new elite. To conclude, if we evaluate these readings on the basis of their specificity, we realize that any archive that may preserve them signals that the significance of their ensemble lies in the difference of their discourses. It is precisely the difference in the viewpoints, in the method of interpretations and approach. From such an open-end interpretative operation, a new perspective arises that welcomes novel visions and unexpected developments. The diversity of these points of view, the discontinuity that emerges from them, eliminates all teleological pretensions to become an operative tool. In this continuity, the plurality of the approaches, the diversity of the researched areas, the deviations, not by all nor in the same measure, from what is predictable, are the most important aspect to notice here. The fact that the essays herein discussed are not the result of an episodic confrontation with Dante's text, but rather originate from studies and editions which are the fruit of years of research, seems to confirm the appropriateness of seeing them all gathered in the present volume. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody, to Professor Albertini, I don't see him, but for allowing us, there you are, for allowing us to use the teatro, and Professor Ardizzone, as you heard, gave us a global presentation and spoke of 4 of the essays. She went in alphabetical order: Antonelli, Ardizzone, Candido, Pirovano. And I'm going to talk about the other 4, and those are myself, Azzetta, Todorovic, and Rea. But I would like to just say again, as we've heard already, that this work is part of a project where we've set ourselves the goal of addressing one of Dante's works each year. And this volume comes out, this volume, Studj Romanzi 14, 2018, with then is a devoted all to these essays on the Vita Nuova. The year of the Vita Nuova conference was 2016, and as I was thinking about that today, preparing to come down here, I was thinking that that was our second global enterprise. The first was in the previous year, 2015, and I was thinking, my goodness, this is turning into an archaeology of my life if we manage to make it through all these globals. And then I was thinking, then when Ara did his introduction, and he mentioned I was president of the Dante Society beginning in 1997, I decided this archaeology has just gotten a little bit too advanced, too deep in its many layers. But so, coming back to the present, we have put these eight essays together. And, oh, I should say then that as a collection of the 2016 papers, this volume takes its place on a shelf of global essays. The other volume, of course, being Professor Ardizzone's own collection of the Monarchia essays, which we discussed here last February, and which she has brought together in a book called Dante as Political Theorist, Reading Monarchia. So if you're going to say, will there be many more volumes? I think the answer is probably not, because...
There is one on the web.
Which one is that?
Rime.
A volume?
Rime. Oh, please, Theo.
Okay. We're doing a volume, a collected volume. Okay. So I'm going to talk about these essays in this order. I'm going to start with Teodorovic's because her essay is on the prehistory of the Vita Nuova. Then I'm going to say a few words about Roberto Rea, whose essay is on the Vita Nuova. Then I'm going to come to Luca Zeta, whose essay is on the post-history or the early reception of the Vita Nuova. So Teodorovic's essay is titled In lingua d'oco, that is in Provençal, Languedoc, dalle carte dei trovatori allo scrittoio di Dante. And she applies an approach very much based on the approach pioneered in this country, certainly by her mentor, Wayne Story, whom we had at last year's conference on the Rime, and which is a material philology approach, very much working with the codices and with the manuscripts. And the cartae that she refers to in her title are mainly derived from Vaticano Latino 3207, which is the manuscript responsible for the diffusion of the troubadours in Italy, and which she dates to the end of the Duecento, but I know we have here an expert on these matters, so I hope that that's correct. So her overarching goal is to show that the Vita Nuova is the work in which a young Dante really claims his status as she puts it, autor vero e proprio. She starts and ends with the trope of we've got to give the Vita Nuova its importance aside from the Commedia, a trope that I personally don't care for. I think we can value the Vita Nuova and not always have to say, let's take it out from the shadow of the Commedia. But that's just my personal feeling. But she looks into the issue of the antecedents. She talks about Boethius, which is what we would expect. And she does, there's quite a bit about Boethius in her book, if you've read her book. Here she really glides past Boethius and goes to pretty much to the troubadours, who are her real interest in this essay. She does have one comment about Boethius as she's kind of taking him on as the obvious one and then going past him, is to note that Boethius wrote both poems and poetry at one time, and Dante did not. And I have to say, one of the most interesting citations of Boccaccio that I found here is I'd forgotten how clearly he put this matter when he writes in the Trattatello, in his biography, when he writes about the composition of the Vita Nuova, which Boccaccio dates to 1290, 1291, as you'll see. We've got Boccaccio on the early end, 1290 to 1291. Professor Ardizzone, when she said 1294, gave us the farther end that we go to, and Azzetta himself goes 1292, 1293. So Boccaccio says, certe operette si come sonetti e canzoni in diversi tempi davanti in rima fatte da lui. And I think it's very interesting to see how clearly Boccaccio says they were written before and then put into the Vita Nuova, something which I have found not enough contemporary writers on the Vita Nuova remember. So, okay, so coming back to Teodorovic's essay, she makes that point about Boethius, and then she focuses really on the Vidas and Razos and how they inform the divisioni, the way that the Vita Nuova presents itself, its use of little razzos in which he explains this is what the poem is about. We divide it into these ways and so forth. He calls them sometimes ragioni, which is related to Occitan razzo, or indeed divisioni, is the word he uses. So she has a nice little chart, which since I didn't do a PowerPoint, I can't show you, in which she shows some pages from Vaticano Latino 3207, in which you see the prose and the poetry alternating between the poem and the razzo, and really claims that as a really important antecedent for the prosimetrum nature of the Vita Nuova. A very interesting point I thought was her discussion, brief but interesting, of the diaspora of the troubadours after the Albigensian Crusade and their relocation to the north of Italy into the Veneto area. She claims, she doesn't give any further comments on this, and I was just curious about it, that the Vitas become particularly important as a result of this physical retransferring and people not knowing as much about them. But the main focus, I would say, is on the mise en page of Vaticano Latino 3207 and the way that material, physical mise en page informs the Vita Nuova. That's really I would say, the thesis here. And ending them with the important observation that while in Vaticano Latino 3207, or indeed in any previous troubadour compilations, the person writing the razzo is not the same as the person writing the poem. In the case of the Vita Nuova, obviously, it is the same person, and this is one of the signature ways in which Dante creates an authority, which is unlike that of any of his precursors. So, Roberto Rea's essay is called Amore e Ragione nella Vita Nuova, Love and Reason, and that's a pretty fair description of it. It is looking at the idea that it may seem unremarkable to note that the love of the Vita Nuova is always governed by reason, but that in fact he wants to claim that this is a remarkable fact given the tradition out of the Vita Nuova comes. I would say, since, is this being televised?
Not live, it's being recorded.
What?
It's being recorded but not televised live.
Okay, so the real question is, am I allowed to say anything critical about the essays? So if I were to say something a little bit critical here, it would be, from the moment we say that the Vita Nuova theologizes courtly love, it's clear that reason is going to be dominating love. It's inherent in the basic move of the text. But so he does, however, do a puntuale examination of the passages in which love and reason figure lexically, even in the language, in order to make the case, going through a resume of the plot of the Vita Nuova, that Dante is working always to create an identity between amore and ragione. Maybe to me the most intriguing moment in this going through of the plot from this perspective was the moment when he comes to Vita Nuova 18, the famous passage where the Florentine young ladies, challenge Dante and say, what kind of love is this you have for Beatrice if you can't even bear to see her, and it's such a source of pain for you? And then he comes up with the answer that leads him to say, in quelle parole che lodano la donna mia, so that he finds his happiness not in anything she can give him, but in what he can do for her. But what Rea speaks a bit about the moment of the Florentine interlocutrici as a moment in which one of them is like a logician and presses Dante to use his reason, making a logical deduction. And I found that part rather interesting. He points out correctly that the prose puts a different kind of emphasis on what he considers this conquista della vita nuova, this importance of reason over passion. And he concludes by noting that Cavalcanti does not go in the direction that Dante goes in the Vita Nuova. So I would say, again, something that we fundamentally do know, as Professor Ardizzone was telling us. So that brings me to Azzetta's essay, which is, frankly, my favorite of the three that I'm discussing. And what I really like about it so much is the amount of contemporary witness that he brings in. This is something that I've become extremely interested in my own work. So my essay on heterodoxy for Professor Ardizzone's heterodoxy conference in this very room. I was interested in contemporaries who saw heterodoxy in Dante, and the example of Cecco d'Ascoli was the one I gave, who has in the Acerba many, many extraordinarily interesting passages, but the one that I focused on is where he says that Inferno 7, verse 89, where Dante writes that a fortuna that necessità la fa essere veloce is a statement that shows Dante does not sufficiently believe in free will. Now, this is not in any contemporary commentaries. It's just been lost to the critical tradition. It's not a verse that it would ever have occurred to me was a verse that could have made a contemporary think that Dante was heterodox. But as I pursued this, I found that neither Benvenuto nor Boccaccio, who do mention it, discard what Cecco d'Ascoli says. Benvenuto comes strongly to Dante's defense, but he feels he needs to acknowledge this, and he says, here's a fascinating sentence where he says, many discussed it, some taking one side, some taking the other. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us who those many are. But he then does mount a forceful defense of Dante believing in free will. I mean, to me, it's enough to say that Benvenuto feels he has to defend this, and he does so by going to Purgatorio 16, showing that he's able to go very far from the text at hand, which is Inferno 7, verse 89, and bringing in the famous discussion with Marco Lombardo. Boccaccio is more timid and says, since this is a matter that involves Mother Church and issues that could get me in trouble, I think I'm just going to pass on this. It's very interesting how Boccaccio doesn't like to deal with things like that. Okay, so Azzetta's essay is chock full of contemporary witnesses, and his title is Fece molte canzoni per lo suo amore e come pare a uno suo libretto cui e pose nome La Vita Nuova, where he's citing from one of these witnesses, Note sui primi lettori della Vita Nuova. And he starts right away in his communication of what he takes to be the date of the Vita Nuova. He presents it not as a static event, but as the moment when Dante releases this work to its public. He writes, quando tra il 1292 e il 1293, o al più tardi nel 1294, la Vita Nuova venne resa pubblica da Dante. And that act of it becoming public and then its first recipients and its first readers and how they respond is what he is going to systematically discuss. He discusses it under 4 headings: le riprese della Vita Nuova nei versi di rimatori coevi a Dante, contemporary poetic responses. Then he goes to archival mentions, then he goes to the manuscript tradition, and fourth, he goes to explicit and direct citations of antichi lettori, of readers contemporary to Dante. He goes no farther than Boccaccio. In fact, he ends with Boccaccio, whom he doesn't really take into consideration, since that would be another work, but basically telling us Boccaccio changes everything, as we know he does. He removes the divisioni, he just completely makes a completely new vision of the Vita Nuova in a way that you could consider a heralding of a time that likes a slightly cleaner presentation without divisioni and so forth, but that certainly in other ways is not at all congruent with Dante's vision. So, I'm just going to tell you some of the highlights of this to me. The part on the contemporary poets, he talks in particular about Onesto da Bologna and Cino da Pistoia writing to Bernardo da Bologna, where he cites an essay by Furio Brugnolo showing, he says, that Cino, in defending Dante against, so we know that Cino is defending Dante against Bernardo da Bologna, but the case that Brugnolo mounts, and I personally think that these kinds of cases get a little bit too precious, that they really are beginning to make distinctions that I'm not sure we can entirely really validate. But in any case, the case that Brugnolo mounts that Azzetta wants to use here for his argument is that Cino is not defending Dante as a still novice poet, but specifically defending the prose of the Vita Nuova. Therefore, this exchange would already be a testimony to the defense of the Vita Nuova. Okay, so that's on that. The archival section is very interesting to those interested, again, in philology. This is Studj Romanzi. It's a famous journal of philology, and I'm glad that we got some serious philology in here. He actually refers to a little piece of a document, of an atto found by Zaccagnini in 1918, of a Bolognese document that refers to the Vita Nuova, but that Zaccagnini never edited. And he actually provides the critical edition with images, with photographs in his essay. I will jump over the part on the tradizione manoscritta, since it becomes very technical, and go to the fourth and final part, which is his section on the early commentators. He focuses in particular on the Ottimo Commento, which he dates to 1334, L'Amico dell'Ottimo, 1337 to 41, and Andrea Lancia, 1341 to 43. And he focuses in particular on Beatrice's reproof of Dante in Purgatorio 30. So this was of extreme interest to me, because this is a passage that I'm extremely interested in many ways. And what he gives us, Azzetta gives us, is passages in which these commentators in glossing Beatrice's rimprovero in Purgatorio 30 cite the Vita Nuova or make reference to the Vita Nuova and really ground Beatrice's words in the storyline of the Vita Nuova with more, in different ways, but it's just very fascinating. One of them specifically cites a sonnet from the Donna Gentile episode. And so I find that really an extraordinarily important part of this essay. He also notes how the Florentine commentators insist on the historicity of Beatrice. Even when they acknowledge other possible meanings, they are always very insistent on her historicity. And then he comes to Boccaccio, saying that Boccaccio is the one who will gather all of this historical material from these earlier commentaries in his Trattatello and Esposizioni. So I think that's pretty much it for Azzetta. I found that a very interesting essay. And then just coming briefly to my essay, which is called Archeologia della Donna Gentile, what I do there is posit that the Donna Gentile episode is really a structural principle of Dante's thought. Of course, he didn't know that necessarily when he wrote it originally, but that it's a recurring paradigm in his thought, the question ultimately theorized by Epistola 3, and this year we've made it through our own archaeology, and we've come to the year in which I get to talk about Epistola 3, but ultimately theorized there when Dante writes about, when he poses the question, which he says Cino posed to him, utrum de passione in passionem, my poor students, they hear this all the time, possit anima transformari, whether a soul can move from one passion to another. And in that formulation of the epistola, we see how a problem that we might have thought in the Vita Nuova was one that we could think of just as, not just because it's still significant, but as a problem only ethical in terms of whether one is constant or inconstant, and what are the ethical obligations, which, by the way, in the very sonnet, that is cited by one of those 300 commentaries, L'amaro lagrimar che voi faceste, the commentary doesn't go into the sonnet, but he simply writes that this commentator, Ottimo, when glossing Purgatorio 30, makes reference to the incipit of the sonnet, okay? But if you read L'amaro lagrimar, and a great part of the essay, of my essay in this volume is devoted to that sonnet, making the case that that sonnet really stipulates a contract that we have insufficiently built into our reading of the Donna Gentile episode, because the sonnet actually stipulates that it is not correct to forget, that oblio of the lady once she has died is not acceptable. One can't move on. One has to be faithful to a dead beloved. Now, this is not in the previous courtly tradition, and it's something that Dante himself is going to work on, though Beatrice is actually going to come back to that exact same position, and that the Ottimo is absolutely right to cite that sonnet. So conclude with the point that that question, which is an ethical one, is it right? Is it right? Is it acceptable to forget a beloved and move to another beloved when that beloved has died? Becomes ultimately in the epistola, it shows its connections ultimately to much larger, maybe not larger, but other kinds of issues that are about free will and determinism. And these are the issues that Dante unpacks more in the Convivio, which we've been discussing, and in the Epistola, and how those forces converge, and how the Donna Gentile is a kind of original, an original incubator for this problem, which is really a problem that he never divests, is really the work I'm doing now, and which this essay is a first go at. So, in conclusion, I would say that the Vita Nuova amply justifies its position as the little book that always can generate more interpretation. It's a libello, as Dante calls it, just a little book, and yet we have written many, many books about it, and the book that Professor Ardizzone and I have just contributed is really one of many and not the last. Thank you.